Good morning. Welcome everybody. Kalimera and schönen Tag. It's a great pleasure to welcome you all here today. And we are both thrilled and honored to host and organize the conference, What is Infrastructural Critique, for the celebration of the life and work of Marina Vishmidt. We had a fantastic opening yesterday in the evening. My name is Sofia Bempeza, and here is Annette Kraus, my beloved colleague, at the Department Art and Communicative Practices that hosts the conference within the Angewandte University. Our department is located at the Institute of Studies in Art and Art Education, where Marina worked as a professor for art theory. The wonderful program for these 3 days is curated by Danny Hayward. Thank you, Danny, but I don't see you there. And Roseanne Gass. Also, thank you, Roseanne. We are delighted to have with us an amazing lineup of speakers who will gradually be introduced day by day and step by step today and tomorrow. Thanks for following our invitation in such big numbers and coming from different cities, countries, and geographical locations. Yesterday, we listened to the keynote by Danny Hayward, who took us with him into and through the movements of Marina's theorizing, and he closely tries to follow Marina's theorizing and living of what she coined as infrastructural critique.
So also a heartfelt welcome from my side. And today we try to continue what Danny brought to us yesterday, these movements and rotations. And actually tonight I was also thinking of spirals, or maybe feeling even the spirals. So we are looking forward to discuss and, as Danny said, move with these parts of Marina's thinking, with which she expanded, shifted, and derailed the notion and legacy of institutional critique towards what she coined infrastructural critique. Infrastructural critique in former Western art and cultural institutions is like looking under the carpet, opening the storage of white institutions and looking for food supplies and recording the repetition of the capitalist cruelties inherent in the ways of communication, administration, and distribution of labor in the arts. However, as we think, Marina pushes it further than only looking or recording. In her words, the point of infrastructural critique is to move from a standpoint that takes the institution as a horizon to one which takes the institution as a historical and contingent nexus of material conditions amenable to rearrangement through struggle and different forms of inhabitation and dispersal. So together with Marina, we ask, what do infrastructural processes enable and what do they prohibit? What moves these processes? How are they moved? How can we move them? And how are we moved within them?
Marina has been a beloved friend, a precious colleague, a brilliant and witty thinker, and a person of direct action within and beyond art institutional contexts. Since her arrival at the Angewandte in autumn 2023, she was involved in numerous educational activities. She soon co-organized with a bigger group of colleagues and students the Movie Nights, which is an ongoing series of screenings acting against the continuous repressions of academic freedom within institutional structures, especially in German-speaking countries. Till now, the Movie Nights have provided a space for coming together, discussing, and mourning in the face of the ongoing genocide in Palestine. Thank you, Marina, for your courage, for your positionality, and your comradeship, and in that case, also an announcement for Sunday evening, exactly in this place. We are continuing the Movie Nights also in this semester, and we're showing A State of Passion, a film on a documentary about Abu Ghassan within the framework of the Palestine Film Days which are taking place in many, many countries and cities exactly on that date, November 2nd, in this kino at 7.
So let's continue today to celebrate the life and work of Marina. She is surely with us today, or hopefully, in our hearts, in our struggles and spirits. And thank you, Danny, again, for inviting us yesterday into Marina's work and reminding us that her work is not tragically incomplete, so in Danny's word, due to Marina's untimely death, but radically open, that is changeable and unfinishable. And as Marina was never tired to emphasize, whatever we do as many. And so has been the work towards this conference, with loads of people involved, so we can make this happen, to be here together.
And now are the thanking of these people. So we take the time to thank all people for their generous support and resources. Once again, to curators Danny and Roseanne. We thank our colleagues at the departments of the Institute of Studies in Art and Art Education for their support. The moderators, Alexei Kukulevich, Amanda Holmes, and Nana Heidenreich. The technicians and videographers, Fine Freiberg, Tatja Skitzlatze, Thomas Mitterburg, and Maximilian Meitz. The administration and facility and the event management, Martina Draxnitz, Alexandra Frank, and Sule Thurner. And the student assistants from the Angewandte here and TU Graz, Meret Kaderas, James Elsey, Maria Janschitz, Valentina Santner, Anna Seusengeier, Ronja Wolf. And also thank you, Rosen Elveley, for the design of the poster and the cover on the leaflet that you can find outside with our program.
And before we go to the first panels, I would like to do some housekeeping. So first of all, and as you probably already saw, the whole event is filmed. So it's videographed and audio taped. So in order to actually put a complete, the whole conference online for public access later, what we thought for people, I announced this also yesterday, who really do not want to be on photos or video, we reserved this part here. So you all will not be on the video, but that doesn't mean that you actually want to. So maybe in the breaks you want to shift. And people from here go over there if that is of concern. Please do so. As you can see in the program outline in the leaflet, we programmed the days, and today very much so in a certain way. So there are always 2 to 3 speakers, actually in a row. And then afterwards, we will have a collective discussion. So the 3 speakers will come up in these nice red chairs, and then Sofia will moderate the first panel. So keep your questions, and we will have enough time afterwards. Having said that, the Q&As will not be as long as the final discussion on Friday evening. So please bear with us when we cut the Q&As at a certain moment. Keep your questions. Let them be pollinated by the other panels for the Friday evening. So because then we have around 1.5 hours with all the speakers together here, and we bring then a collective discussion, or try to enable a collective discussion. And then now I hand over to Sofia, who will introduce the speakers.
So, and now we start again. I'm very happy to invite to the stage, to the red chairs, Natascha Sadr Haghighian, Roseanne Gush, Natascha, Roseanne, and Helmut Draxler. So Natascha Sadr Haghighian would be the first speaker. Her presentation has the title Flames to Dust, Figures of Entropy as Anchors of Value. And oh, okay, there was a mistake in the recording. So, figures of entropy as anchors of value. No, just flames to dust, people. Flames to dust. Okay, flames to dust. Okay, another gap. So, Natascha develops installations, video and audio works, as well as performative interventions to imagine infrastructures and conditions of collectivity. Roseanne Gush, now with the title Figures of Entropy as Anchors of Value. Roseanne Gush is an art historian, theorist, educator, and sporadic artist and curator, and also teaches at TU Graz. Sporadic? You say it, you nail it. So, and Helmut Draxler is going to present a paper with the title Institution, Infrastructure, or Critique, Reconstructing the Lines of Conflict. Helmut Draxler is an art historian interested in the intersections between art, philosophy, politics, and psychoanalysis. And he also teaches at the Angewandte, and he was longer here, also having the position of Marina. So if I'm not forgetting something important, I would like to give the mic to Natascha Sadr Haghighian. We are very happy that you are starting the presentation.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Sofia, for this lovely introduction. And thank you, everyone who made this conference possible. I feel very humbled to be part of this. And I'm looking forward to the days that we spend together thinking through Marina's work. Thank you also, Danny, for this brilliant and very generous introduction that you gave yesterday that feels like an entire commune to spend time in and to think through. It was an amazing opener for this conference. So I was very inspired also by the movements that you both enacted yesterday and spoke about, and I think what I'm trying to contribute is a kind of movement, a speculative movement that kind of starts with an image, and it's the image of dust. I don't know if I should put this down a little bit. Yeah. And I'm not even sure whether it's theoretically sound, but it feels right at this moment. I might stumble and fall during the movement, but it's a working thought to maybe just to offer. It just makes me curious about the problem that it poses. So dust is everywhere. It's in my mouth, powdering my eyelids, creeping up my nostrils, sitting in my auricles. Not a layer left ungritted. Last year, it tasted like an ending. This year, not so much any longer. The dust became an image, a toy of speculation. Something to spend time with, to pay close attention to, without knowing the outcome. Maybe a concrete universal of kinds. I could not make any work last year. I had no drive to make, and the mere thought of it had a bad taste. I couldn't also show anything. There was no excitement about that entire process. Liberal institutional spaces felt impossible to enter. And it felt as if they had fully unmasked and looked really, really ugly. Contemporary art triggered nausea. It was an alienation that was not altogether new, but new in its scope and depth. And it felt irreparable. and irreversible. Then I learned that more people experienced similar things, a shared experience of an ending, a collective sense of loss and rage, of depression and of despair. Having not only been unable to stop a genocide, but being complicit in so many ways, pulled the plug from many things that had somehow managed to be normalized. For a little while, the liberal cultural institutions had almost made us believe in their sincerity for reforms. People working in the institutions seemed to have embraced the necessity to dismantle structural racisms and colonial hegemonies. And they wanted to change the institutions from within. A lot of them quickly faltered under pressure. Some actively turned into genocide defenders. And it became clear that the freedom of expression, one of the core values, had a price tag. The hurried and anxious obedience of institutional leadership, giving in to pressure from right-wing bullies, and throwing artists under the bus, artists and scholars actually, under the bus, exposed the actual priorities. The liberal order had never been separate from fascism, in fact, sharing a kernel. Marina paid attention to this, and she spelled it out for us. I came to call last year zero. In this maximally alienated and alienating moment, it's been preciously helpful to revisit Marina's analysis of the ruin at the core of the liberal order, the sovereign individual. Marina left in year zero. Her razor-sharp analysis and her abundant humor is irreplaceable. Yet she left us with invaluable writing that will keep us busy for years to come. In year one, the genocide is still ongoing with impunity. Institutions are in a state of amnesia. The space of politics has been largely evacuated. And still, something is different. Personally, I'm strangely more able to collect my thoughts. In the middle of everything, it suddenly feels meaningful again to build things, to self-organize, to dream and speculate and imagine what, as Sadr Haghighian says, you have no evidence for at all. Imagine outside of the plausible, outside of existing categories. The pulverization of the liberal order brought the dust everywhere. Some of it toxic, some nourishing, and it strangely opened imagination beyond the ruin it had been when it was still doing fine. In her essay, New Ruins, a version of which Marina already held in a conference in Paris, the White West Conference, and then in another version in Venice, and then she rewrote it to be included in the publication Beyond Repair. There she speaks of culture as a shorthand for ideology, while being as structural as it gets. For Marina, structural critique and critique of ideology, while seemingly diverging, they are actually very close. And they yield analytic value in their combination, not in their separation. The main ruin that Marina attends to in the text is the fetishization of the sovereign individual, the source of all biopolitical value, moral authority, and cognitive credibility. For Marina, this points to a primary route and root of fascism, both historical and contemporary. The sovereign individual might be synonymous with whiteness in a structural way. I want to share three excerpts from this text, New Ruins. The first one that deals with the fetish of the individual as represented by the artist or citizen. So the fetish of the individual, artist or citizen, and the sanctity of the individual's property rights to their speech and creative imagination should be seen as both a result of and a compensation for the suppression of thinking in terms of community, collectivity, or trans-individual responsibility that decades of neoliberal ideology, as enforced by the conditions of everyday life, have established as the absolute bedrock of whatever social contract we still can think about. Fascists mobilize the fetish of the sovereign individual to organize wounded individuals who feel their rights are being infringed. The second quote I wanted to share from this text deals with the question of why fascism becomes a thing once whiteness is actually affected by it, while it could be seen as a continuity by so many other communities. So why is fascism only named as such when it is whiteness that splinters into lives worthy of life, and on the other hand, on the one hand, and the death or deportation of other newly forcefully dehumanized whites, as in the Second World War and the Holocaust, but not recognized in the consolidation of whiteness against its predetermined others that constituted and continues to constitute the modern polity. From that vantage point, fascism comes to seem like simply the intensification of the long-ingrained lethal tendencies of the existing mode of production and governance. Capitalism without a filter, the grinning face of more and more people rendered surplus on a global scale, which now also includes the planet being burned in the furnace of accumulation. The third one deals with the artist in particular and the freedom of expression or freedom of speech that sovereign individual that is the artist kind of represents, or represented, I would say. Every time an artist is given a free pass to question or problematize without any consequences, regardless of their own ethical or political beliefs, it's a feedback loop between the sovereign individuality of the artist and the sovereign free zone of the institution of art. Certainly, this is a notion of autonomy that has been comprehensively deconstructed at the level of discourse. But this makes no difference so long as the institution of art is maintained through and affirms the sovereignty of capitalist accumulation through its practical existence as a space apart. So Marina spoke about art that captures its own making. I want to believe that this would have to include its unmaking as well. Tracing the unmaking of the fetish of the sovereign individual as a way to trace the ruinous presets that made it in the first place. And under this thought, I wanted to read a short piece called "To Dust." But to give you some context before, this piece is part of a project called Solo Show that started in 2008. And not unlike Robert Morris's The Box with the Sound of Its Own Making from 1961, Solo Show was meant as an artwork that tries to record the sounds of its own making, tracing the invisibilized divisions of labor and authorship in art production. Robbie Williams, a fictitious artist, was created as a means to record the sounds of his own making. He first appears in 2008 when his Solo Show portrays the work of the production company Mixed Media Berlin that produces the works of many known artists but stays largely invisible. The Solo Show is spelled out as the making of many hands and minds and begins the work of abolition, abolishing of the sovereign individual and the sanctity of his property rights. Seda Nayamat appears around the same time as Robbie Williams. She's an assistant, equally fictitious and equally and gradually writing herself into the fabric of the real. She is, by virtue of her reproductive activity, a collectivist, flightly but strategic, associative but not identifying, let alone owning. So now we are in 2025, and it might as well be Robbie Williams' final solo show. To dust. So first we hear from Seda Nayamat. I think it was me who saw the marble with its pearlescent shimmer first. It rested next to the base of the stage, between security and the protesters. Its perfectly smooth roundness flashed and twinkled as protesters were moving. When I looked up to Robbie, he seemed to have seen it as well. He glanced at it curiously, while his body otherwise seemed calm and held. He was standing on stage next to the curators, his hands holding onto something, maybe a note. For a split second, our eyes locked, and I could see everything that I felt, but could not put in words. It was as if the room, no, actually the world, had come apart, split in two opposing stakes, and we both held our breath, staring at the marble's curve. I was with the protesters. I had told Robbie before, and he had just nodded, not looking happy more in general, not because of me necessarily. He didn't say it, but I knew that he knew that this show was going to blow up in his face. It had been ill-fated from the get-go, but ambitions and the pressure from his gallery had dominated the conversation early on. He was convinced he could use his leverage to make a difference and win the museum over. If we just abandon the institutions, they will never change, he said. I felt he said it more to himself than to me because he knew my position. Institutions had been consistent in being hypocritical, and the genocide just fully unmasked their complicity in a rotten system. Robert Shamil Williams, you know I'm not a liberal, I responded. I can't help you. I looked at him and saw a flat character. He was not Robbie, who I knew as a friend intimately for so many years. He was the protagonist of a warped social order, and he was not ready to disrupt the social field that had made him. He believed he could negotiate with the museum, and we believed in his leverage. I have to go. Good luck, Habibi. So now, Robbie. It was to be my biggest solo show to date. Everybody was excited and had been working tirelessly. Both Tim and Mark had encouraged me to think of this as my personal blockbuster, a move into the upper echelons of the arts. So I don't know, I just felt unusually hesitant, almost uncertain. Besides, the past 2 years had been beyond horrid. There were tensions way before the opening. The entire art world was in turmoil, divided over the response or the lack thereof towards war crimes committed by Israel. Some people had signed stuff in protest and were then pressured by collectors to remove their signatures. Some people had been laying low in public but were very vocal in private. Some people were confused and felt they didn't know enough to take an informed position in what they called a polarized situation. Anyways, it was complicated. Sometimes it felt as if it was tearing at the very core of stuff in the arts. I felt devastated by what my feed was showing, but also too occupied with production to properly participate in anything. The news kept me up at night, endless heart-wrenching testimonies of death and destruction, but also of defiance and resistance. Palestinians documenting the targeting of their homes, of schools, hospitals, universities, parents burying their children, infants who lost their entire families, doctors operating without painkillers or anesthesia, cemeteries bulldozed, farmers salvaging crops from the rubble, starving aid seekers being shot while collecting moldy flour from aid sites. It was utterly depressing and enraging. At some point, activists from Sadr's circle reached out to me asking if I would be ready to cancel the show in protest. Many people were involved in this exhibition. Several institutions had teamed up, an architectural firm was commissioned for the displays, and some people who had been supportive throughout my career were backing it. There was simply no way I could pull out. I did think about it, I had to. Who wants to stand on the wrong side of history? But it was impossible, too late in the process, to let all these people down. But I could do something from within. I felt I had leverage and was on good terms with the curators. Haha, what a joke. Now standing on stage next to Tim and Mark, I felt as if the floor had cracked right open, leaving us hovering over a gut of steaming viscera. I could foresee how we would all be devoured and turned into dust. Nothing would survive the nonsense written in Tim's opening address. Nothing would remain. What a shit show. My mother's voice purrs. Cemilchanim, they're afraid of us. Be kind to them. She always defended them like a good immigrant would. She was married to one of them, so yeah. Was that what I was doing here? Being kind? Then I saw the marble. It was sitting there right in front of the stage, that gaping gut under my feet. It was so small, but shiny and round like a pearl. I saw Sadr among the crowd. She had seen it as well. We looked at each other for a second, and suddenly all fell still and silent in the midst of the boisterous, urgent chants, drowning Tim's lies. I saw Tim leaning into the microphone, his mouth uttering words I could not hear. He looked like AI, continuing his speech despite the fact that he will be turning into dust any moment now. I saw banners carried by waves of bodies. I saw many faces, some familiar, some not, chanting and clapping, and I saw the marble somehow being the epicenter of all anticipation, all possible outcomes and direction. I remember thinking, it's so perfectly smooth, while all else is rugged. It felt like everything was falling apart, except for the pearlescent shimmer of this marble. By the time I was able to get down from the stage, the crowd was traversing towards the exit. I glanced at the marble next to my foot, and then at Sadr and the protesters, swiftly exiting the museum, banners held high and still chanting. Gradually, Tim's voice reappeared from under the clamor. Our work is grounded in essential values that are non-negotiable. As a museum, we are deeply committed to freedom of art and freedom of expression. My gaze followed the crowd proceeding outside. Behind the huge glass walls of the modernist building. In the window frame behind Tim, a large banner started to appear. It advanced like the wind, unfolding under many hands. Once stretched over the entire glass surface, it read, Staatsräson is genocide. I watched the staff and security inside rushing to the window, trying to cover the word genocide with their bodies. Another glance at the marble, and my hand reaches for it. I don't know whether I actually managed to touch it, as it all happens in a single breath. While my eyes are pinned to the shiny round surface, the entire museum around me folds down, everts, and spills its glass and steel structure into the surround. The fresh air hits my face like a rock and makes me gasp. I had intended to take the marble and walk out of the museum, but now there's nothing left to walk out from. Only the marble still sitting next to my foot is unaffected. I gasp for air again. Apparently my body is still standing upright, but I do sense a strange ripple across its surface, almost like a shiver. My lips are moving, channeling the strokes of air. My eyes are touching all that has unraveled around my feet. I can't discern inside and outside, and I do not dare to look further ahead. Keeping my eyes to the ground, I start walking towards where I suspect Seda is. The crunching sound of pulverized glass under my feet. In the residue, I recognize remnants of my sculptures. I'm done. I hear my own voice. Tamam Hadi, I'm done. In the distance, I hear chants. The marble. Of course, we didn't destroy the museum. We're not brutes. Not that we have issues with militancy, but we actually like modernist architecture. What you saw was all in Robbie's head. This is how he imagines things ending. Quite cliché if you ask us, but to give Robbie some credit, it's kind of consistent with his imagination if you look at his work. So this is not exactly what went down. What did in fact happen was that contemporary art died that night. Well, not exactly that night, but that's a longer story. You're asking why it had to die? Before the revocation, contemporary was another word for complicit. It was inevitable that something had to happen, and something would have happened anyways if we left it to the new reactionaries. But when contemporary art ended, it did not end art. Quite the contrary. Contemporary art had been holding art hostage in an endless present that continuously deferred and suspended the historical. In this deferral, it cultured a general numbness that it called aesthetic experience. Let us tell you, it was really an anesthetics that eventually became a playground for fascism. Contemporary art had reigned by means of a whimsical but sophisticated operant conditioning system with unbound rewards, but also coercive narratives of exclusion. Funnily, it held definitory power without accountability. In short, it was a joke, as Robbie found out that night. What happened was that time had started counting again. The time of the dead as much as of the unborn. The time of stones. The time of dust and dirt. The time of things breathing and breaking. The time of names and naming. As Solmas said, let it matter what we call a thing. It goes without saying that praxis is a thing, that study is a thing, and that things are looking pretty bleak. For now, art remains as thermal shadow, allowing us to disperse and feel out the topologies of the surround. We linger at folds and recesses, traverse open fields of utter devastation, and find remains of sociality in the stretches between what for now we call tradition and anticipation. We find that flatness and roundness are not opposed, and that some properties are preserved even in dust. We learn how to touch these properties and to turn them into infrastructures. I want to leave with sharing this drawing that Marina made accompanying the text for New Ruins. It's a wonderful drawing, and it kind of I've been revisiting it a lot in the last year. It's kind of it's like I feel it's like a map of sorts, and maybe it could also guide us through some of the movements that we want to try out during the conference. Just quickly to leave with some questions around what just happened, because we find Robbie engulfed in dust, and his understanding of freedom of expression has basically pulverized. And I think that's something to take quite seriously, because we haven't really developed a language of how to replace that understanding of freedom of expression. And as it's now all dust, and some of it toxic and some of it nourishing, how do we discern, what to do with this dust? To not just throw it all out, but how to separate the dust, how to work with it, how to move in it and with it. But it's also interesting to trace some of the movements here, because Sadr and her friends, they know that the dust is coming. And collectively, they have this understanding or this intelligence, both in terms of the infrastructure and the ideology of the institution. And they do this partly as a result of analysis, and partly intuitively, and partly because they come from a different tradition, in which they don't identify with that freedom of expression that Robbie is still entangled in, and kind of makes him stay inside. So they know when to enter the institution, but also what to do there, how to use and repurpose existing infrastructures and ideologies without identifying. But they also know exactly when it's time to leave. So they know the time, and they are somehow movement and moving. And their movement seems to instantiate instantly communalizing infrastructures and sociality in action. And somehow in between the two, I would say the project of staying with the dust is setting the scene for me. So I would just leave with that, and hand over to the next speaker. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you so much to everyone for joining us. And I also want to thank Helmut Draxler for kind of beginning this process with us as well, with Danny and also Antonia Birnbaum. So I just want to kind of extend my thanks in that direction expressly. Okay, so my paper is a bit long, so I'm just going to start, but I feel like there's an echo. There? No? Okay. But I think this question of staying with the dust is very beautiful for me. So thank you so much, Natascha. And so I first met Marina in late 2010 while I was an art student at Goldsmiths in London. And I remember discovering her writing and her thinking in various locations, such as Mute Magazine, Variant, a performative sleepover at the ICA in London, organised by the group Stodelac, called What Struggles Do We Have in Common, as well as small art galleries and lecture theatres. And I was really blown away by her work as an art student, and because she brought together the questions that I thought were really urgent, like if you're an artist, how can you act politically, or how can you kind of engage in anti-capitalist struggle when art was constantly a kind of hustle game, especially in London at that moment. And so Marina brought together the question of labor and feminism and art into this kind of very wonderful constellation. And she really emphasized the complexity in the sense of like how they shape that moment. Marina was part of many groups, which I'm sure many people know, but one of them was, and they were all organizing radical culture and kind of forms of politics. So in a sense, she was a teacher on this like larger scale. So one example was Full Unemployment Cinema, which since 2008 had produced screenings, pamphlets, posters, and flyers on cinema and anti-work politics. And it took place, at least for some time, at Colorama Cinema on Lancaster Street in London, until that social infrastructure, like many squatted or semi-squatted social centres, was closed down. It was demolished and transformed into gentrified housing. So in 2015, in one paragraph of an essay titled "The Aesthetics of Singularity," Frederick Jameson diagnosed, "In our time, all politics is about real estate." And he continued, "Postmodern politics is essentially a matter of land grabs on a local as well as global scale. Whether you think of the issue of Palestine," and then he was referring to the 2014 Operation Protective Edge, or of the gentrification and zoning in American small towns. It is that peculiar and imaginary thing called private property in land which is at stake. The land is not only an object of struggle between the classes, between rich and poor, it defines their very existence and the separation between them. So Jameson's political diagnosis, which extended to name the system of enclosures of Aztec and Incan empires, to their present-day home foreclosures and dispossession, homelessness, unemployment, tendencies to outsourcing and governmental austerity still holds. And though it was written slightly later, it spoke to the political and social conditions under which I met Marina, conditions dominated by sweeping privatization of public institutions, liberal institutions, especially universities in the UK and beyond, aggressive gentrification of whole swathes of London, and like the counter-movement of mass organization and protest. So Colorama Cinema was a kind of do-it-yourself cinema in a long-term squat, which was located on Lancaster Street, and the people running it had installed a massive makeshift bank of seating, which I remember I was kind of amazed by it. So I remember sitting at the top of this, in a kind of squat at the top of this large structure. And Marina, in 2011, Marina, who'd also kind of been in and out of our student occupations, where we were protesting the privatization of our educational institutions, she invited me and my friend Rona Lorimer to discuss our zine that we'd produced like as an intervention into the student movement, called Rage, at a screening that she organized with Full Unemployment Cinema titled Thorough Cleaning, Double Bill. And the zine was also a kind of product of collective work with comrades from within the student movement and also campaigns fighting against the outsourcing of cleaners. And I remember having this feeling of like, this was a whole new world for me, and also a whole new language. So I was incredibly like amazed to be there, and it opened so many horizons. So I remember sitting for 3 hours on top of this homemade and impressive wooden bank seating, watching 3 days of Jean Dielman in Chantal Ackerman's film, a middle-aged sex worker clean her home, peel every potato, slice by slice, prepare and cook each meal, wash the dishes, sexually serve men, look after her son, while the camera remains static at one height, so that you as a viewer are put in the position of the voyeur. This was part of a kind of introduction to feminist cinema in the context of a squatted social centre, one of various of such projects that existed in London at the time, and that also fed into this kind of whole realm of movement, including occupations and mass protests and so on, and various other projects of practical critique, reclaiming and transforming social space. And this specific focus on the politics of social reproduction was part of what became a shared theoretical project. So in early 2012, we were also part of a feminist reading group that started by Zoe Sutherland and Hannah Black. I don't know if Hannah's here yet. With a specific orientation towards Marxist feminism and a kind of commitment to thinking about reproduction against capitalist reproduction and thinking the abolition of those conditions and the abolition of the social form of gender in light of the difficulty of its strategic affirmation, which Marina would later write in her essay called The Paradox of Self-Abolition. And so we began that reading group in 2012 with a text by Thierry Communis titled Gender, Distinction, Programmatism and Communization, and various other texts including The Logic of Gender by Endnotes. And this reading group proved to be an infrastructure of self-education oriented towards collective thought and possibility. And we met at each other's homes, at public spaces. Sometimes we traveled, like here we were in Lithuania. And we had a method of reading out loud and then discussing the text like paragraph by paragraph. And we worked through a lot of material very slowly, and it expanded in all sorts of, our discussions expanded in all sorts of directions, producing also, producing all sorts of kind of like very interesting debates concerning the role of gender within the reproduction of capitalism. And that was why we found this banknote building very interesting for our like excursion to Lithuania, because we were interested in the fact that we were oppressed by patriarchy and capital simultaneously. So this was already central to Marina's work in its insistent and continuous incisions into the naturalization of reproductive labor, where splitting it up, and recontextualizing it, showing its social fact was the point. And Lan Abzi-Gogoti, who also co-edited the book with Danny and Kirsten, described the reading group as a sort of experience where you feel you are holding ideas aloft in a magical sort of way, a collective spell of thought and conversation. So in the context of David Cameron's big society of self-managed decline, there was also a critique of self-organized infrastructures that promoted survival and resilience over deeper transformations. And we might look back on this differently from the standpoint of today's very radical attacks on all manner of social infrastructures. And in Danny's introduction to Infrastructural Critique, he writes, in her, Marina's thinking, infrastructural reproduction will not be affirmed against critique, but neither will critique be affirmed against the reproductive necessity of infrastructure. We need both, or I add the last sentence. So I was also inspired by how these questions crystallize in relation to art. How does art, and this was really central to Marina's work, also with Kirsten, how does art behave as a form of or analog to social reproduction? So in the co-authored chapter of their book, Reproducing Autonomy, Work, Money Crisis and Contemporary Art, Marina and Kirsten use the notion of entropy to analyze art's relation to social reproduction. They write, the problematic of housework as reproductive activity par excellence, in that it seems not to produce anything but only enables the production of discernible capitalist commodities to go on, can be addressed through its dimension of entropy and measurelessness. The entropic, limitless character of housework starts to seem like a subjugated but basically functional analog of the entropic, limitless activity that in late 20th century art emerges as a sovereign form, a point already grasped several generations ago by 1970s feminist artists. So back in 2016 and the years preceding it, Marina and Kirsten diagnosed art as functioning institutionally as a social palliative. Art increasingly takes on the role of social services or maintenance work, as capitalism in the West had subsumed creativity. So if Marina and Kirsten also then remove its useful aspects, such as the maintenance of life, they diagnose art and social reproduction as both functioning to reproduce systematically the capitalist totality in the kind of Adornian sense, where art is also called upon in its socially reproductive role by the state and capital. Underpinning this is communization theory's proposition that because of transformations in class composition, affirmation of Fordist models in class struggle were no longer tenable. And they look to housework and sociality as sites of unproductive labor, unlimited in their capacity for reproduction. As such, they focus on the negativity or anti-sociality of reproductive labor, its ability to undermine use values, its intersection with human strike in the language of Clairefontaine, and so on. In its entropic character, this is a quote, systemic reproductive function in capital's totality encounters a shared negativity with reproductive labor when they argue reproductive labor enters the self-image of art. So their examples include Lee Lozano's Dropout piece, which began in 1970, and General Strike piece, which began in 1969, where art engages in non-art as Lozano stops making. As Lozano stops making, Charlotte Poznanska and Lydia Clark withdraw from the art world to do something else. For Marina and Kirsten, this implies that reproduction can function transversally as a category of solidarity within art, showing the contours of a nascent infrastructural critique. They claim that in finding the outside of their work, these artists reject its institutionalized role as reproducer of bourgeois life. The works move within different reproductive mediations, including sociology, the study of labor and industry, social work or therapy, modes to organize life differently. And they focus on works that withdraw from the institution of art, realizing their negative relation to the reproduction of capital on the level of the social, again prefiguring, I would suggest, infrastructural critique. As such, they aim to recast determinate negation through reproduction, shifting the emphasis from production to reproduction on a systemic level. Entropy starts to stand in for non-reproduction, anti-sociality in Lee Edelman's thesis, gendered reproductive labor and artistic labor, forms valued for their valuelessness and uselessness, come to be negatively revealed as measures. So, again, in her essay, the two reproductions in feminist art and theory since the 1970s, Marina again uses the term entropy as a modality of how we might experience alienation from the perceived usefulness of reproductive labor, in the sense that a woman's work is never done. So Jean Dielman returns as a figure who cuts or embodies this entropic labor, where the sheer repetitive entropic character of her life as work culminated as a source of psychic terror and disorganization, and that's how Marina describes it, on an effective level. And the protagonist tries to keep at bay with rules and routines with diminishing success. And this, Marina describes this as kind of maintenance as unworking. And likewise, we see a kind of similar model in Mia Lademan Ukele's dust paintings, which describe the entropic character of work and as it contributes to revealing its absurdity and futility. And Marina notes that all socially necessary labor, waged or not, shares this entropic quality. Work that is not recognized as work meets its own unrepresentability as an image. It disappears, is consumed and unravels into pathology rather than delivering a product. This is her idea. So the theme of the entropic appeared again in 2022 when Marina gave a talk at a space in Graz called Annenstrasse 53 that I was involved in. And in this talk and in the same year, she brought her orientation towards entropy into the remit of landscape and nature, addressing the relationship between violence and form, both in relation to art and the geophysical world. Her input was pivotal. I can say it was really a prompt or really inspiring for me to think about the political aesthetics of art practices in relation to our current ecological crisis. And I was thinking about this also in relation to some teaching that I was doing in the Faculty of Architecture in relation to a mine, which is very close by, which is slated to become the first active lithium eco-mine in the Austrian Alps. So the central image of this mine was basically in the propaganda of the company, the car driving back into the mountain as a kind of, or it kind of represented to me like an auto death drive, as the car like is trying to return to the earth. So Karen New Daggett writes that thermodynamics mapped the new earth through the figure of energy, a unit that retained its identity through time, energy conservation, even as its tendency to dissipate, entropy, imparted a tragic edge. So the entropic, the tragic aspect of finite, inevitably dissipating energy led to the anxiety that it needs fixing and recharging. The term energy then expanded to include a technical sense and was in the 1970s conjoined to its pair crisis. We are constantly hearing the language of energy crisis. So in the 1970s, that energy crisis actually gave rise to the rechargeable lithium battery, which was developed within ExxonMobil for the electric car and soon after abandoned to be renewed today in light of permanent wars and imminent climate breakdown, in large part due to the burning of fossil fuels. So anecdotally, this mine in Austria also functions as a kind of significant protagonist in the EU's Green Deal or twin transition to a decarbonized and digital economy, a planned transition to renewably charged automated labor. And this transition, which we're also kind of seeing like as we speak, today flip past us as we approach a kind of the jaws of a full rearmament, also resonates with a tendency in contemporary art to return to and invent land art by focusing on technologies of energy extraction and ecological collapse, or also questions of value. So this is an image of Cameron Rowland's Depreciation that I'd love to talk about in the Q&A. So in her work on these questions, Marina brought into view the spectrum of value and valorization and entropy and devalorization, combining notions of dispossession and devalued labor with cheap nature through her interest in the void and voiding. In this very short talk, which was also a response to a poem by Danny called Loading Terminal, she posited art as a means for the production of nothing, the production of voids. So again, art returned as this kind of index of the void, referring in passing to an article by Elizabeth Nicola titled "The Artist is the Void." And in this moment, Marina's art objects are no longer feminist iterations of reproductive labor, but the much-hyped NFTs, non-fungible tokens, which come to stand in as the pinnacle of, in her words, the climate nihilism of financialized capital. With Nicola, NFTs become a means of creating voids. Entropy and exceptions, and this is to quote Nicola, entropy and exceptions intersect in the ways which capitalist economies and societies operate. Sorry, that's to quote Marina in Infrastructural Critique, thereby extending the formulation of entropy from housework to include wasted natures. More precisely, in her work, this dynamic once again extends from Marx's surplus value to theorizations of capitalist social relations that focus on the X of capital. So moving beyond exchange and exploitation to extraction, expropriation and expulsion, and this is in the Infrastructural Critique. So in political ecology, as Marina describes it, we see this principle clearly. Nature is simultaneously constructed and devalued, and its devaluation affects everything from racialized and gendered labor to non-human life or the geophysical world as a prerequisite for all of its commodification. So entropy, and I quote Marina, entropic waste is at once the exception to and constitutive of value. the wastedness of Jean Dielman's time and labour is brought onto a plane with non-human life or geological strata, echoing in some sense the work of Catherine Yusof, I would suggest. This logic leads to a kind of permanent primary, in Marina's thinking, permanent primary accumulation, which can also be located in the world ecological surplus discussed by Jason Moore, linking it to the exhaustion of resources by the expansion of surplus capital. So she diagnoses a, quote, parallelism between capitalist production and waste, which aligns with the surplus population, identified by Marx as a corollary to the capitalist mode of production, as well as the devaluation of reproductive labour. End quote. In Marina's thinking and in the infrastructural critique, this making entropic, this wasting away, is presented as crucial to capitalism's expansion. In art, it is no longer an image or something which simply renders the absurdity of waste visible. This entropic figures are anchors of value. Waste is as crucial to capital's reproduction as the reproduction of labour power. And this contradiction is identified by Marina within Marx's own work, where the absorption and expulsion of labour power are fundamental to Marx's theory of the reserve army of labour as a pool of unemployed workers that keeps wages low and workers disciplined. Capitalism needs to absorb labour to produce, but it must also expel labour through automation, through our current transitions and crises, in order to attempt to maintain profitability, maintenance as working, not unworking. And as Marina extends this same logic of simultaneous absorption and expulsion beyond the worker to encompass the entire living world, the exhaustion of one's body, the expulsion of a community from its land, and the creation of sacrifice zones and terminable landscapes. In the sense, like if we recall Jameson, in our time, all politics is about real estate. Postmodern politics is essentially a matter of land grabs. All politics are about the land. We find a metabolism of waste. And she writes, I quote, "Every act of production by the worker is simultaneously the production of their own superfluity." End quote. Within this, processes of racialization mediate dynamics of surplusing, orienting them towards certain communities, evident in genocides, carceral landscapes made up of refugee camps and the prison industrial complex, and resource frontiers. And again, to quote Marina, "Violence is the consequence, land expulsions, housing displacement, gentrification, and the creation of sacrifice zones, the cause." So in returning to Nicola's Void, Michael Heitzer's, which she refers to in relation to Michael Heitzer's earthwork Double Negative, which is made up of two massive trenches cut into the landscape of Mormon Mesa in Muapa Valley, Nevada, mark a shift in scale, where the sculpture produced by removing 240,000 tons of sandstone from the landscape shrinks in the face of the vastness of the landscape itself, thus destabilizing her subjective orientation. And Nicola writes, "My sense of being nothing was profound. Compared to this, Double Negative seemed puny. It wasn't 50 years old, yet half a blip in the geological record, and walls already collapsing, perhaps faster than Heitzer planned. It looked a lot like any roadside gravel yard, with dusty hillocks of grey-brown rock tumbling into the channel made when a backhoe extracts a load." So the vastness of the desert reduces the monumentality of Heitzer's negation itself in a state of accelerating decay. But significantly, she raises the question, where did this 240,000 irrelevant tons of sandstone go? And so in Nikula's spatial analysis, the void, or Heitz's void, takes up the same amount of space as its byproduct, like the amount of sand or rock extracted from any infrastructural tunneling. Here, the void starts to index its opposite, the so-called double negative. Earthwork, as artwork, starts to index what she calls industrial earthworks, more impactful, more gigantic, more numerous, and what we would normally call capitalist infrastructure. So industrial earthworks are highways and dams, estuaries, drained and filled, massive solar panel arrays over bulldozed desert habitats and shipping channels. They are mines and military detritus. So they are the holes and tunnels in the world, gaping chasms. They are often the result of land grabs and population displacement. In fact, Nikula's vision echoes Martin Arboleda's idea of the planetary mine, where modern cities are invoked as the technologically, philosophically, and economically inverted mines of distant resource hinterlands, where the mineral wealth excavated from the depths of the earth is consequently fixed in the urban built environment. And for Arboleda, thinking of cities as inverted mines then warrants asking what sorts of spaces of extraction are behind these fantastically alien skylines of megacities, some of which have been transplanted directly from cyberpunk universes. What kind of barren terminal landscapes are produced in that inverse, or in Marina's terms, voids made in the world just for these elevated cities to rise up? So extending Nikula's vision, Heitz's is an example of art that indexes this form of extraction, shaping the landscape, extraction of natural resources and labor. And double negative is turned into a kind of icon of American and planetary extraction. Earthworks, in Nikula's phrasing, earthworks such as Heitz's extract for the sake of extraction. Yet Heitzer and land artists like Smithson did not conceive of the conditions that functioned as enabling constraints in Marina's terminology, and this is also Marina's kind of observation, which relates again to this kind of sovereign bourgeois subject that enabled their works. So, for example, they didn't understand the conditions that functioned as to turn, or that underpinned the turn to dematerialized or attempted decommodified entropic works. And as Marina shows, dematerialization as escape was based on an illusion, and land art was entirely dependent on the conditions of possibility given by and infrastructures of US imperialism and colonial expansion, as well as industrial agriculture, Cold War military budgets, and the displacement of indigenous communities that the artists either did not notice or may have imagined that they were transcending. So to reiterate, Marina was kind of thinking about, like earthworks, NFTs make holes for the sake of it, holes for holes' sake, a veritable autonomy of wasted energy, but on a far greater scale than simply extracting 240,000 tons of sandstone. NFTs burn through huge amounts of carbon just to exist. And artificial intelligence, which we all know now requires mass quantities of water and energy just to be able to train its data, is kind of following this model. And we're now seeing a kind of full AI trained, like, war infrastructure being built. So I'm also like realizing that I'm running out of time. Okay. So I will just say, like, in some of the thinking that I've been doing, I've been like looking into, or from Marina's work, I've been kind of interested in thinking about how or if we could think about infrastructural critique in relation to this transition, or what that might look like, and in relation to the reality that, for example, even if the transition now demands like to do an energy transition. At the moment, the EU only has access to like 2 to 3% of like materials at the point of extraction. So it's like a complete fallacy. It's unable to do this. And now we're in this new kind of fascist time when, there's not even a kind of like impetus to do the transition. We're back in the kind of drill. Trump's ethos is drill, baby, drill. So in a sense, all of this is producing a recomposition of capital in the sense of a kind of expanded or increased level of surplusing of labor through automation and an increased destruction of the planet through extraction. And these combining are producing a picture of a very bleak future. So I'm just going to end now by saying, for Nikula and Marina, the void of the earthwork cannot counter its harm. And the NFT, but we can add AI or all the dust-inducing materials or activities, they've surpassed land art in its capacity to create inverted horizons. And the production of enormous amounts of waste, annihilation or nothingization of the world is correlative to the production of voids in the landscape. In the absence of use value in NFTs throughout Marina's work, the exceptions to value are also the anchors of value, in the sense that unwaged labor and uncommodified nature enter the value cycle as simultaneously free inputs and piles of waste. And I wanted to say something more about infrastructural critique, but maybe I'll just we can keep that for the discussion. Okay, thank you.
Hello, everyone, and thank you very much for the invitation, Danny and Roseanne. And I'm delighted to be able to take part in this event, and that it can be held here at the University of Applied Arts. So also thanks to the organizers, Sofia and Annette, but also other people like Brigitte Felderer, who were supporting that from the beginning. Okay, I only got to know Marina personally towards the end of her life, but we got on very well right from the start. And it is, of course, incredibly sad that we were unable to continue the exchange we had just begun. I'm therefore unable to speak here as an expert on her work, but only about how productive her approach was and still is for me. For there is no doubt that her work represents a great challenge for my own approach. In my curatorial work, in particular, I was associated with the movement that became known as institutional critique. And even though I myself have rarely used this term for various reasons, Marina's critique of that term and the associated practices, from which she distinguished her own coinage of infrastructural critique, still touches on crucial aspects of my own theoretical and practical positioning. That is to say, we undoubtedly differ in terms of fundamental theoretical and practical approaches. And yet there is a common element, an interest in an overarching left-wing project, of course, but perhaps also a methodological, essentially undogmatic element that particularly fascinated me about her choices, artistic choices, but also her methodologies, like what Danny was speaking about yesterday. So despite the sharpness of her arguments, I see in this undogmatic aspect a moment which seems to connect our works. Marina's critique of institutional critique, I'm referring here primarily to the 2016 text, Between Not Everything and Not Nothing, Cuts Towards Infrastructural Critique, concerns above all the institution itself as a place of false totalizations, which she sees as analogous to the false totalizations of capital. Her argument here is similar to that of Terry Eagleton, who warned already at the beginnings of the 1990s against understanding capitalism as a seamless, integrative system, precisely as it itself wants to be understood, so that any criticism of it always comes to nothing. Accordingly, as Marina argues, criticism of the institutions themselves can still be affected by such false totalizations, especially when it is limited to circular, symbolic self-referentiality. In contrast, infrastructural critique is essentially transitive and establishes links between the inside and the outside, the materially given and the possible, the conditional and the unconditional, in order to better grasp structural power relations in particular and to escape the sad self-accusation between complicity and conformity. This was undoubtedly directed against Andrea Fraser's seminal 2005 text From the Critique of Institutions to the Institution of Critique, which highlighted these ambivalences, emphasizing extensive identification with the institution in the sense of we are the institution, that is a quote, and elaborating on the consequences of this identification, even to the point of melancholy, as in the case of Broadhouse, for example. There are good reasons to put this conflict into perspective, as Sabit Buchmann, for example, does when she says that institutional critique has actually already largely been some sort of infrastructural critique. This is certainly true, already evident in the work of Broadhouse, Harke, Rossler, even more so in the work of Farid Armali, Fred Wilson, René Green, and also in Andrea Fraser. As well as when Eric Goldstone, he wrote me an email saying that institutional and infrastructural critique can or should be intertwined. Marina herself seems to have expressed a similar view in later texts. Nevertheless, it is important to me to take up the initial critical impulse of Marina's work and not too hastily reconcile the cut she speaks of. For I consider making theoretical and political conflicts fruitful to be an indispensable prerequisite not only for emphasizing conceptual, theoretical, and ultimately tactical political differences, but also to address what is, in our catastrophic crisis-ridden world, the final front line, namely the crisis of the left itself, in order to adequately grasp this world in terms of radical emancipatory goals. So what is this conflict about? In order to understand its severity, but also its possible potentials, we must begin with the fundamental distinction that one form of criticism is being pitted here against another one. The crucial question will be how these two different forms of criticism can be understood in relation to each other, how strictly they differ, and to what extent their political reach is rooted precisely in the distinction between them, and thus how the overcoming of the one by the other can appear meaningful or even possible. However, they might also be understood as two ultimately interrelated forms under a common principle, such as a general critique of capitalism in its various manifestations, or even just as two variants from a wealth of other possible forms of criticism. So is this conflict about the one and only critique, or about two or many possible forms within a multiplicity of empirical appearances? So this is my crucial question. Yeah, is there one critique, two, three, or many? Yeah, not Vietnams, but critiques. In order to make the conflict productive here, we must undoubtedly start from the first variant in the sense of two antagonistic forms of criticism. Although there have long been attempts to distinguish between different forms of criticism, internal and external, literary and political, artistic and social, all these different forms do not necessarily stand in a conflictual or even antagonistic relationship to one another. John Roberts, however, has attempted to emphasize such a rather conflictual dimension of artistic negations, drawing on Hegel's distinction between first and second negation. In his view, the first negation corresponds to the autopoietic criticism in the sense of Niklas Luhmann, as essentially related to the recursivity of art, its reproduction qua internal differentiation, and extensive isolation from the outside world. Yeah, that is the first model. Whereas the second negation, which he relates to Hegel's absolute negation, can be understood as a leap, quote, into freedom through the negation of negation. Only in this second form of negation he sees a force of liberation at work, which he is eager to identify with a revolutionary cultural practice. It's not the time here to discuss this kind of Trotskyist perspective in detail, leading to an idea of, permanent revolution. And I have, quite some difficulties in understanding that. However, it's a useful distinction. So referring to classical Marxist terminology, Roberts' distinction suggests that institutional critique could be understood as a critique within the superstructure, while infrastructural critique acts on behalf of the base. It would thus affect the actual dimension of social change and not merely its representative overhaul. Intervening at the level of infrastructure would also promise to interfere into the processes of social change themselves and point the way to liberation. And indeed, Frederick Jameson, again, had already used the concept of infrastructure as a counter-concept to that of superstructure. I mean, that is part of a post-Arthurian, theory making. Jameson, in his early work, Marxism and Form from 1972. So he's not using the classical translation of Basis und Überbau as, base and superstructure, but as infrastructure and superstructure. And in this sense, infrastructure would not only refer to the material distribution channels in the sense of supply and transport, electricity, water, waste, internet connection, streets, railroads, supply chains, but also to the material foundations of every social and cultural manifestation. Yeah? So that means not to a purely horizontal spatial dimension, infrastructure, connecting different things, but a vertical one and a thoroughly dynamic temporal one, between the base and the superstructure. This in turn raises the question of how the concepts of institution and infrastructure can ultimately be integrated into the base superstructure scheme and thus related to the decisive instance of Marx's theory of revolution. The problem with this, however, is that the base already consists of two parts, the material forces of production and the social relations of production. And it is only together that these two parts confront the superstructure, the ideological representations of intellectual entities such as art, law, religion, or philosophy. However, it seems to me that it is not entirely clear in the Marxist theoretical tradition how the social relations of production as part of the base actually relate to the cultural superstructure in the sense of being determines consciousness. Das Sein bestimmt das Bewusstsein. For if being is already divided between the material and the social, when the question arises as to how these two parts can relate to the superstructure, since no similarly strict opposition can be assumed between the social and the cultural on the one hand, as between the material and the ideal on the other. Material determinism can somehow be argued for. I do not, but logically it seems to me possible to argue in that direction. But social determinism is a different case. As Bourdieu's concept of habitus clearly shows, this idea, of social determination leads to the aporia that such a theory could not itself be stated, because then we would have to get out of this habitus and this class reproduction. But how shall we do that? We simply would no longer be able to make any relevant statement outside or our own habitus or social class. This means that the relations of productions, the social sphere, necessarily already contain conceptualizations about themselves. They must therefore be understood more at the interface between base and superstructure, and it is precisely this interface, the differing boundary line between base and superstructure, where the concepts of institution and infrastructure overlap. For institutions can best be understood as social infrastructures. They always mediate between what is broadly understood as customs, traditions, rights, or habits, and what is narrowly understood as culturally, religiously, or politically shaped structures or forms of such repetitive behaviors, like in the shape, of a church, the museum, the parliament, all the, ideological and repressive state apparatuses Althusser is talking of, or the state itself as a kind of super institution. Conversely, the concept of infrastructure cannot be limited to purely material circumstances. It necessarily also includes social and mental dimensions or dispositions. Otherwise, it would be difficult to attribute any critical potential to it. The first task, therefore, will be to distinguish between the two terms in their logical implications in order to be able to assess their respective potentials, but also their problematic nature in terms of political applicability. So we'll first turn to the concept of institution and then to infrastructure and then sum up everything in the end. So the value of the concept of institution as a fundamentally empirically sociological term certainly lies in its ability to capture the moment of institution, of the instituting moment itself. That means the establishment and implementation of social rules, norms, or values. In other words, the term operates in the field of tension between individual behavior and collective norms. It refers to a highly dynamic process and by no means to static entities. Therefore, as the discussions between Adorno and Arnold Gehlen on radio and television in the early 1960s already showed, everything boils down to a dialectic between established and non-established behavior, enabling and repressive functions between freedom and coercion. Every critical discourse participates in such a dialectic and therefore implies institutional moments, otherwise it would not be able to claim any validity at all. It's really surprising, this debates between Adorno and Gehlen, the left-wing hero and the former Nazi, that how well surprisingly well they got along with each other in a certain way. The differences are only in detail, what kind of, within this dialectic, which kind of pole they would, emphasize. In his farewell lecture in Frankfurt earlier this year, Christoph Menke even took this approach toward a fundamental ambivalence of institutions a step further, in the sense of a praise of the institution. A praise which, following Merleau-Ponty, he understood to mean that the institution only fulfills itself through criticism. Criticism and thus self-transgression becomes the very meaning of the institution. As a permanent self-transgression, so to say, not a permanent revolution. As much as I would like to endorse this praise of the institution, which seems to me more necessary today than ever, I think we shouldn't do the job of the right, and abolish the institution completely. This expansion of the concept of an institution to embody social dynamics also has its price. Not only is it dangerously close to the self-regulating autopoietic view of the institution, only expanded into the infrastructural field, it also implies pure positivity in the fusion of institution and critique. So the concept of institutions thus refers not only in its empirically sociological form to the difficulty of thinking the negative. If the meaning of an institution, and that is Menke's point, lies in a repetition of its implementation, and thus in its ongoing distinction from pure customs, traditions, or rights, then the negative aspects of both implementation and repetition is still preserved, even in the transcendental, open positive form Menke is highlighting. This negative aspect must therefore be addressed in its dual form. On the one hand, this negativity concerns the non-institutionalized, that which is separated, outsourced, rejected, and excluded in the very act of institutionalization. And institutional critique can address that kind of negativity very well. On the other hand, however, the non-institutionalized is contrasted with the negatively institutionalized. That means that which is necessarily institutionalized along with the various forms, acts, and processes of institutionalization itself, even with the best intentions, to overcome the first kind of negation. For every form of institution as a kind of positivization of social relations is accompanied by a negative doppelganger that first distinguishes it from the non-institutional and must therefore itself be instituted as a specific form of violence. And these forms of negative institutionalization cannot be overcome in principle because they represent a necessary substrate of positive institutionalization. For institutional critique, as long as it participates in institutional logics at all, this negative institutionalization constitutes a real challenge. It will always be hard to distinguish between a real critique of them and an acting out in their service. So that is the logical point where the implication of institutional critique with the institution becomes evident. There is this double, negativity in a certain way. So now the term infrastructure, it is also, as I can see it, I'm not an expert in that as well, essentially an empirical concept, but one that originates not in sociology, but in urban studies and media theory. In their 2001 book, Splintering Urbanism, Networked Infrastructures, Technological Mobilities and the Urban Competition, Steve Graham and Simon Marvin examined the shift in the logic of urban infrastructures from the grid, regulated by the nation states and covering a specific territory, to a neoliberal and digital network, from grid to net, whereby not an entire territory is supplied by the network anymore, but only certain nodes. Building on this, Keller Easterling was able to launch her large-scale attempt to link specifically urbanistic, neoliberal, and digital production logics with the concept of infrastructure. She situates these production logics in a field of tension between shiny surfaces, the digital surfaces, and hidden dispositions, whereby these no longer mediate between individual units, buildings, objects, institutions, or states, but have themselves become the actual productive operation. as active forms, that is a crucial term, active, decentralized and deregulated forms with infrastructures keep modern life running in the form of supply chain, financial flows, digital platforms, and even those special urban zones around the globe that are largely beyond the direct influence of state. That is why she calls all these different manifestations of infrastructure extra statecraft. As an empirical finding, this is certainly great, especially when you consider that in 2015, when the book appeared under that title, Extra Statecraft, the resurgence of a state as we are experiencing it today was not yet foreseeable. And yet, the theoretical reconstruction she carries out following Bruno Latour's actor network theory seems problematic to me. Consequently, Easterling's book always becomes vague when she refers to a politics of infrastructure and possible subversive uses. For her, infrastructures are software that can be repeatedly hacked or sabotaged from the outside. So they don't seem to affect us at all. And the fact that since the beginnings of digital culture, yesterday's hackers are today's system administrators seem to bother her as little as the peculiar intertwining of classical ideology critique. It's still the most powerful people remain the actual actors of infrastructure, controlling the hidden dispositions. This, Latour's actor network theory, a theory which explicitly aims to remedy precisely the misery of such, traditional criticism, ideological criticism. The actants, they don't need this kind of critique anymore. And, the misery of criticism is this point Latour is making over and over again. There's no time to go into this in detail, but that is the theoretical framework for Keller Easterling she's drawing off. And that makes clear that, and this is the only point for me here, that without an explicit political context, the question of a possible critique of this concept of infrastructure cannot function. And this is how I understand Marina's commitment, even if I cannot name her sources precisely, because this discourse of infrastructure has, been diffused already at, in the early 2000s, early 2010s. Such specific political involvement is indeed part of a radical left's tradition. Many attacks in the 1980s and 1990s targeted infrastructure facilities, such as immigration offices with their archives, or even a prison shortly before its completion. Programmatically, this approach to sabotage was taken up and intensified by post-situationist groups in France in the early 2000s, most famously Tikkun or Invisible Committee. But this is precisely where the fundamental problem lies. Because since the 1960s, these infrastructures have been developed specifically to immunize themselves against possible acts of sabotage or disruption. The famous ARPANET and the beginnings of the internet sought to create a technology that could survive even a nuclear strike. That makes clear that acts of sabotage can be used to disable maybe a railroad switch for a while, but such means cannot achieve more than short-term interruptions. Breaking through the general context of delusion, den Verblendungszusammenhang Adorno is speaking of, is therefore highly unlikely to succeed. And this problem seems to be getting worse today. Because in newer forms of technology, such as blockchain, artificial intelligence, or quantum computing, infrastructures themselves seem to be becoming increasingly autopoietic. With his permission, I have to quote now one of my, many brilliant PhD students. His name is Ingraban Medicus, who attempts to describe these technologies as operational infrastructures by using the tools of process philosophy in the following sense. Here's the quote. Today, technology no longer refers merely to devices, machines, or applications, but to an operational structure in which reality begins to establish itself. The term unfolds, the term technology unfolds its formative power not by describing existing objects, but by generating the difference that makes a new reality possible. The revolution is not what is coming, it is what has already been set in motion conceptually. End of quote. So Ingraban refers here to the fourth level of industrial revolution in the sense of an implementation of structural givens for any future change. So the future is not open and unforeseeable, but it's already, planned, structured, acted out in many ways. And I fear that this has consequences for a conception of a political revolution as well. It makes at least clear that we cannot view, evaluate, or even combat infrastructures from a safe distance, as Easterling seems to suggest, but that we are always already fundamentally affected by them in our own ways of subjectification. And this reveals a different problem with negativity than in the concept of institutions. Negativity is here not simply accepted or even instituted, rather its abolition and reintegration are always anticipated and thus neutralized before it even can take effect. So, but how and where can we then establish a position from which these infrastructures can be criticized? Again, we should not understand capitalism and the technological modes of being it has produced in terms of a seamless farce, totalization. Otherwise, we simply would not be sitting here. And of course, the intrinsic negativity of capital is not actually made to disappear, nor is it perhaps veiled in an ideological sense, but simply removed from conceptual access through ongoing processes of division and segmentation. Critical thinking itself is also affected by this, because we are increasingly moving in segments that are strongly separated from one another. We should therefore take into account that infrastructural critique will probably not simply overcome the pitfalls of institutional critique, but that it rather seems to be haunted by its own ones, at least as long as we think of infrastructures in purely empirical or material terms, wherein lie the strengths and the weaknesses of the infrastructure concept at the same time. So on the one hand, it brings in this material, productive dimension, but on the other hand, it's also stuck, in this empirical understanding of, what politics could be, and I think this is a really serious problem. So if I see this correctly, however, Marina provides a crucial clue by linking the problem of empirical with that of segmentation. For her, infrastructure is a conceptual diagram, meaning it is neither an empirical entity nor a type of software code that can be easily decoded. Understood as such a conceptual diagram, the term infrastructure itself already combines the different levels of empirical material realities with the descriptive or conceptual access to them. Infrastructure becomes a methodological tool for capturing both with different empirical facets and their fundamental relationship to their transcendental prerequisites, as well as possible perspectives beyond them. In this sense, infrastructure becomes a multifaceted mediating concept, and that is what I'm mostly interested in. I would like now to conclude by attempting to briefly outline this conceptual diagram. I don't know if Maria has ever done this. I can only do it, in my own understanding. And in my view, it would look like something like this. In analogy to the slightly modified base superstructure distinction as sketched out earlier, we could assume three levels: mental, social, and material or technological infrastructures. These three, levels have developed three corresponding forms of critique: ideology critique, institutional critique, and technological or infrastructural critique. The question then will be how these three levels of infrastructure relate to each other and whether the three forms of critique can be synthesized into a single one. Again, one or two or three critiques. Yeah? The problem consists in the fact that mental, social, and technological infrastructures today are intertwined to an extent that was previously unimaginable, as we can see in social media and so on and so forth. In their dynamic momentum, they also shape the anticipation of the future and thus our own positions. Against this backdrop, the idea of a unifying form of critique seems highly necessary, but at the same time quite unlikely, because any idea of critique is certainly already part of the mental infrastructures it would have to criticize, as well as part of the segmented social infrastructures from which it can only act. So also infrastructure critique is part of the problem of the infrastructures. And that's why I think it has to be multifaceted and not, just one ready-made concept. As long as such unifying criticism based on the new infrastructural conditions cannot be found, and I consider this structurally almost impossible, I have to admit, the insistence on the three forms of criticism seems to be at least appropriate. They can and probably should not be converged, because in their specificity they shed light on each other, and from each of their limited perspectives they reveal the intrinsic problems of the others. That is the productive moment of the conflict. In addition, if criticism alone cannot be the answer, due to a lack of mental, social, and material self-transparency, this can only mean that every form of criticism must be directed at specific forms of practice. Again, this cannot be the one revolutionary practice that would immediately result from the correct criticism, but only different, conflicting forms of practice, such as artistic, political, or philosophical practice. With regard to artistic practices, Marina had suggested expanding the canon of the major artists of institutional critique, such as Hans Haake, Michael Escher, Marcel Protas, Martha Rosler, Louise Lawler, Andrea Fraser, and so on, mainly, but not only, in order to include art activist approaches, thereby integrating groups like the Art Workers Coalition, Document Arte, from the 1960s, 70s, up to the Gulf Labor Coalition from the 2010s, and so on and so forth. I agree with this. The discussions Andrea and I had within the Services Project from 1994 was not only discussions, but also, struggles, pointed in this direction. Beyond that, however, I would suggest expanding the canon in the other direction as well, namely toward non-critical, essentially formalist practices. For if we understand formalism not simply as an exclusively self-referential, autopoietic or aestheticist phenomenon, but rather in the sense of the Russian formalists as a set of operational procedures that can help not only to avoid the dogmatizations of political discourse, which was the very purpose of Viktor Shklovsky's concept of defamiliarization, but also to work and to reflect on the boundaries of the social, mental, and media segmentations of the fields. And then a different picture emerges. Formalism then becomes a necessary, progressive endeavor that can ultimately only be understood in the interplay between artistic and art-critical engagement. It seems to me that art-critical engagement is also necessary for art activist practices, which have found their own infrastructural work form in the idea of the project. Projects and large project exhibition should therefore be discussed not only in terms of content, but also in terms of a specific work form. But that might be more my own project. With regard to political practice, I don't have a lot to say, but at least it could be stated that if any practice claims to be political, it should be related to what could be called Marxist categorical imperative, namely that passage at the end of part 2 of the Communist Manifesto, where it states that in place of the old bourgeois society with its classes and class antagonisms, there will come an association in which the free development of each is the condition for the free development of all. This famous phrase, yeah, the free development of each is the condition of the free development of all, is certainly not moral but political, yet just as categorical and imperative as the Kantian one. Unfortunately, I see this condition fulfilled in hardly any of today's diverse political struggles. The focus is always on particular perspectives, and these are certainly important too. Perhaps it is also due to my own particularly limited view, which is blinding me with respect, I would, accept that. And yet, one must bear in mind that the proletariat, in the Marxian sense, is never simply the empirical mass of workers exploited in factories, but always also a representative of the universal, the class that no longer knows classes. So there's a rift here in politics itself, which cannot be absorbed into empirical struggles alone. Frantz Fanon summed up the paradox inherent in this in a much-quoted sentence, saying that the struggle must be not only about one's own liberation, but also about the liberation of a French foreign legionnaire, that means the enemy. A sentence which, in my opinion, requires that one's own negativity be incorporated into political thinking and political practice as the vanishing point of the universal. And finally, this is my last paragraph, as a philosophical practice, we cannot understand the repetition of discursive patterns, as philosophical practice, but merely the setting of concepts and the working upon them. Yeah, and that's what I liked on Marina's, commitment. And the question is how the political problem just outlined could be grasped philosophically then. It arises in a field of tension between transcendental and speculative philosophical positioning, in which Marina has navigated in quite an elegant way. For the most part, she leaned towards the speculative side, since her, as we heard yesterday, early on dissertation and so on. And so such toward the view that the problem of one's own negativity can be overcome by a kind of leap, a bold speculative proposition, for example. However, there are also aspects in her writings that locate the concept of infrastructure in the tension between the empirical and the transcendental. And here, the negative would be a necessary part of this tension. It determines the possibilities of the empirical as well as those of the transcendental, precisely in the acts of demarcation from one another, and therefore cannot be overcome speculatively. You can't jump within this kind of transcendental. I'm not Kantian, but I think it's interesting to use the Kantian terminologies to understand this as in itself a speculative philosophical position. And it means that you can't, just leap out, like Münchhausen, or what is the name, out of a problem. Rather, this negative aspect must be made explicit at its limits. Otherwise, it will inscribe itself as an uncanny doppelganger in our efforts and good intentions. It therefore necessarily remains related to forms of criticism and practice, and must be addressed from within these. This means that the difference between the empirical and the transcendental is not simply one transitive dimension of an infrastructural, series, one difference of many which could be linked by infrastructure, but it is a special dimension, because the transcendental is not accessible, in the same way as, empirical differences are. But it's also not an, purely abstract principle, logical contradiction that could be overcome by a simple speculative leap. But what is it then? I have no answer. I would have very much liked to discuss with Marina how to understand this specific difference in its equally enabling and limiting conditionality, and obviously also in terms of its political and artistic consequences. But perhaps someone else here in the room can help me out. Thank you.
So I'm not going to steal a lot of the time, because here I have the almost impossible task to make some observations on these three papers, and maybe just to refresh a little bit our minds, like from my point of view, and then I will directly open to the audience. And before that, maybe you would like to comment on each other on different parts, but I just give some hints now just for us to remember. And I will start with Natascha with this very situative and touching presentation. And you started from year 0 to talk about images of dust, about the liberal institutions as genocidal defenders. And then you connect also liberalism with fascism in terms of the sovereign individual and all this legacy, and also the legacy of whiteness and the fetish of the individual artist or citizen that is connected, and how, let's say, fascist individuals are states themselves as wounded individuals that need our attention. And you went on with several points about the state of amnesia that the institutions, the liberal institutions, seems to have nowadays. And also you went on using fiction in your work, like when you made this, I would say, second part of the presentation, and how you as an artist and thinker, you put fiction into reality, creating these figures that talk to us, the marble, the fake person of Robbie Williams, the fake artist persona. And you're also asking within this dialogue if art has become a playground of fascism, and how to replace the freedom of discussion if the language we have till now is somehow failing us, and we have invented this language yet. So we are in the dust, and probably we're gonna remain in the dust, more or less. So this is just some glimpse of your presentation. I hope I do justice to you with this very short summary. And then Roseanne opened another big chapter talking about production and reproduction in the arts, connecting with Marina's work. And I want to stay at this main term you used, entropy, entropia, which is actually like a term from the physics, from the thermodynamics, one of the rules, let's say. And it means a lack of order, of predictability, and this gradually decline into disorder when a system that produces thermal energy for conversion into a mechanical work somehow is unavailable to produce this energy. So there is also waste, and this gradually decline into this disorder. So, and then you take this term to connect it with the anchors of value. And then you quote, of course, many artist positions that have talked about the relationship between productive and reproductive work, like Ackerman, Ali Lozano, Kelles, Ligia Clark, and so on. And you have there, if I remember correctly, you quote the book by Marina Vishmidt and Carsten Steckermeyer, where they talk about the reproduction of autonomy. Yeah. I know you're here. And there is another part in this book, if I recall it correctly, where you both write that art is social service and remains art, and reproductive labor is social service and remains reproductive labor. So about these relationships between, I hope I do justice to this quote, but I remember like this. So there is this connection between production and reproduction of our own bodies as artists, thinkers, and all other identities. And there is also this exhaustion of one's body that is connected to the exhaustions of the land, of the resources that you, let's say, went on the further part of your presentation, talking about extractivism, like whether in the Austrian context with a mine, or like the general dispossession of people of their lands, and what is capitalism is about, property and land grabbing at the end of the day. And I'm not going to go to the NFT stories now because it's going to be very long. But maybe to end with a short. Helmut was not short, but I'm going to give the hints for that. So Helmut, you talked about the structural parallel relationship on the beginning, and this relationship between a critique, let's say from the side, how to escape self-accusation between complicity and conformity within liberal institutions of art, cultural institutions, and this, let's say, differentiation between Andrea Fraser and Marina Vishmidt. And then you open up the crucial question on your paper about the number of the critiques. How many critiques? And is there an antagonistic duality? You said two antagonistic forms of critique, or two forms of critique in the artistic negations, like going to Hegel, and then the negation of the negation into the revolutionary cultural practice, and then going down later to the infrastructural critique and the differentiation between the basis and the superstructural, I mean in the Marxist concept. But then you pose a question about the cultural superstructure and how are there horizontal and vertical connections that are inherent between infrastructural and institutional critique. So maybe this point is like quite challenging to discuss. And of course, like how we can read infrastructural critique today with the examples that you brought, and the shift in the logic of infrastructural critique, like if we observe the urban infrastructures or like the technologies that are changing our surroundings. You said about the autopoetic of contemporary technologies that somehow connect more or less with the delusion that Adorno was highlighting. And we end up with the negativity, the segmentation, and the conceptual diagram that Marina was proposing for connecting ideology critique, institutional critique, and infrastructural critique. And also like the quality of the speculative aspect for that. So now I'm wondering if you would like to break it down with me and bear with me how to make connections between your papers in different levels, and also take the questions of our beautiful audience. Do you have direct comments to your papers?
Thank you so much for this summary of all of our talks. I'm very impressed. There's a lot of connections, both resonant and dissonant, that I find quite interesting to think about. And obviously there's strong resonance for me between the idea of the dust and entropy and waste or wastedness, but also reproduction that you bring up in your paper. I just recently had the wonderful opportunity to spend time with Park MacArthur and Jason Hirata, her partner, and we had this interesting conversation about. I mean, when we use these terms, I would say we always use them tactically, meaning that we know of their lifespan, that we have to drop them at any moment when they become useless, and so I called myself an infrastructuralist the past couple of moments, knowing very well that it might become useless, maybe even during this panel. But Jason, he said, "Oh, that's so interesting because I call myself a reproductivist," and because he thinks through reproductive labor as artistic practice, and I thought that the two are so interconnected in what unfolded here today in the morning panel, in thinking of maintenance as unworking, in the entropic sense, but also in the abolitionist sense, and maybe these two are connected once we step out of critique in a sense of building something, but maybe of unworking something. So critique, in the way that I can relate to it, whether it's infrastructural or otherwise, would always have to be a movement, which with Laurent Berland, Danny, you laid out so beautifully yesterday in action. Like it's a movement. It's nothing that you can put down in a permanent way. So the entropy sets in at the very second you spell it out, maybe in a Michael Heitzer way of like, the wall will never stand. Saying that, I think I have, and this is, it's also productive. I have this dissonance with how, Helmut, how you approach and understand infrastructural critique. And maybe this is because I have to come from movement. And this is maybe because I think through and with migration as something that shapes how I can navigate through the epistemic violences that have created infrastructures and institutions that I have to maneuver. And so there's always, the disobedience to those epistemes that kind of that shape and kind of create the movement. So maybe just as a starting point.
Like to directly.
Yeah, I would agree. Obviously, we are in different social positions and we have different histories, and that's why those empirical differences are substrate of what constitutes politics in the end. But it's not if we think still in terms of the idea, and that's why I'm talking about the crisis of the left. What idea of a reconciled society beyond this kind of empirical differences and the positions we can take up within that, which are absolutely necessary, and otherwise we won't have any kind of politics. But maybe it's not enough, or it depends on, otherwise it's just shifting the power codes from one edge to the other one, or whatever, and that, and from that perspective, it has become very difficult to address, the success of the right. Why is it so impossible, and why did we lose, within 2 decades, we lost, 20-30% of the population, yeah, in terms of support of migrational politics. Yeah? And I think those are really, unpleasant questions, but I think they have to be raised in one way or another within a context which creates, which still raises the problem. And within that, I think the main difference we might have, or which would be interesting to discuss, is obviously the role of liberal institutions. Yeah? So for me, the liberal institution is clearly, the adversary. Yeah, it's die Gegnerschaft, yeah, but not an enemy. It feeds me well, and I'm happy that the institution is doing that. Yeah, I'm not, Marina was writing about, the paradoxes of self-abolition. I can understand that, but abolition is coming anyhow. So it's not my first goal to have a self-abolition. So disruption and abolition have to be reconsidered within this kind of in our relationship to liberal institutions and structures. Yeah, and I think this idea Marina had with the gaps. Yeah, I think that is very, very interesting. Yeah, there is a gap, between fascism and liberalism. Yeah, it's not the same. Yeah, there is even if it's sometimes only a tiny little gap, but there is a gap. And I prefer sitting here and not in Moscow or wherever, or in Gaza, or where, you name it. And I think it needs a left-wing perspective to, conceptualize that, and not just saying, all the bad fascists over there in the world. Yes, there are, yeah. But it's still a question of how to, not only it means, and the real challenge for me is how, do we have to fight against them, or do we have also to fight for them? What is this idea? What do we want of those people, we produce in our own negativity, yeah, as fascists, as racists, as whatever. That is the challenge Fanon had. This, the liberation has also been concerning the, the French Legion, yeah. And I think this is, it's not that I have any answer to that. I don't know if anyone has, but maybe you, please. Yeah.
I can say something. Yeah. No, thank you so much. I think it's a really productive discussion from these different positions. But maybe just to think through some of the gap between liberalism and fascism, because I think, or Alberto Toscano wrote in one interview, I think, that so if you take this longer view on the development of fascism in relation to its relation to liberalism, fascism is the kind of expression of liberalism's carceral underbelly. Yeah, but it's also the enjoyment of that from the position, from these potentially from the wounded figures that Marina talks about, right? And I think maybe this was also something to kind of think about in relation to this question of of the affective level infrastructure, or the psychic infrastructures, the way that I think Annette yesterday talked about habit formation, how to I mean, you can't just go and like change someone, right? So or who has a racist investment. So, but the question, I mean, no, I'm not gonna say that, but but I think my question is how to, because I would just say, yes, there is a gap, and I think this is what's really interesting in Marina's work, because she is still willing to strategically identify with some parts of the institution. So I think also at the end of this Entropy chapter, there's this question, which is how can you, like, she's not giving up trade unionism or all of these liberal institutions. She's saying, no, we need to strategically use them to try to build some more space for our struggle because of the reality of this abolition that you're describing from the right. So I think that's what's interesting also in the work with Kirsten, where the emphasis is on it's on like leaving the institution of art, that there's this kind of radicality, But at the same time, in infrastructural critique, there's still a possibility of of kind of engaging with this liberal institution, like also we're sitting here, right? So so it's, I think maybe other people have. I've been really interested in how to think about this question with Marina's work in relation to the present that you've really beautifully described, which is like how these institutions are kind of suddenly, all these liberal institutions which made all these promises, like really like reveal themselves as this kind of hideous, ugly forms of genocide apologia in a way. So I think it's really like a question that I don't feel resolved in. Okay, I'd love to hear from other people.
Now it's the time to open for the audience. I see already some hands. Here. Please help me there. So Angela and there, and Angela, Kerstin, and there. Can you step up, please? Also for the documentation, if you feel comfortable to stand up.
Hello. Okay. I think I wanted just to try to bring in a few points that might be helpful in talking about institutional critique and infrastructure, insofar that what if we would say the art, whatever, society, worlds, and so on, we are kind of looking at are institutions of mental health. So we could also talk about psychiatries or medical institutions. And if they are, we have a history of institutional psychotherapy, as we know, but also of the abolishment, of the deinstitutionalization of these institutions. And what if that is so? The act of leaving is an entirely different type of affair, because you are not there because you want to be there, but you're forced to be there in a certain sense. So one institutional differentiation that I think kind makes sense, and then the politics around it could be interesting to see, even though going back to the artistic expression or the expression, the field of expression, the field of what means expression in our society, post-liberal societies. And of course, there is another thing with that, as you know, and you know me and some things that I have tried to work on. This is this dialectical figure of empirism / transcendental system. Is that still so? Really? I mean, do we still have that? I mean, I'm kind of amused to find it, or I find it often nowadays in several talks. Why apparently not much has been added to that, but there is the same question: is the question of rupture here? Where is that figure of ruptures within that type of dialectical constellation? And and of course, I'm agreeing in some points very much in terms of trying to find a new Marxist, post-Marxist, process-based, empirical figure of calling it operations. And I think this is something that links all of you together, the politics of operations, insofar as it is a different scaling in place. It's not panoramic, it's not just in the detail, it's a dynamic scaling that is operating all the time, using whatever necessary in order to operate. So this is just a few points, and I think it actually connects everyone with everyone. So have fun.
I have more like a comment to Roseanne, because there was, when you showed this picture of the Colorama cinema, I had this, and then you were talking about the 3.5 hours of watching Jeanne Dielman on this wooden structure that was built there. I also had this bodily memory of being slightly chilled. It's like this kind of cold spaces. And what I wanted to hint is actually maybe also when you said now you're working at a university or in a department of architecture, this kind of link of the spatial aspect and the body memory that we have of being together in this space. It's more like a comment.
Thank you for sharing that. So, yeah, there. Sorry? There you are. Yeah.
Thank you all three for some fascinating insights. My question is directed to Roseanne. You sort of suggested you were interested in speaking a bit more about Cameron Rowland, so I wanted to give you that opportunity.
Please.
Okay, thank you so much for the interesting talk. And my question is directed to Natascha. Concerning you quote the text of the of Marina's text on the fetish of individual, and namely the two figures, artist and citizens, which are both glorified almost the same times in Europe, and this kind of Eurocentric ideas of the figure is almost unimaginable to get rid of in the contemporary art world today. So, my question is, as artist and practitioner also in contemporary art world, which is also a very complex infrastructure today. How do you cope with this kind of situations and to deal with the fetish of individualists or the fetish of individualists? Thank you.
Thank you. My question is for Helmut about the relation, because I think, going back to when Marina and me wrote Reproducing Autonomy, like our problem with like the third chapter, which we wrote together, was that was the pitfalls of reproduction and the pitfalls of SRT also. So the question of in how far can one argue through the pitfalls of reproduction, its affirmative core, and like while pushing its heretic core. But what I would say, like what back then was already our problem, and as soon as the book came out, like when we were presenting it somewhere, we were always taking it apart because we thought we weren't like negative enough with it. And by now, negativity has come full circle. So I would say like there is a shift between like thinking about the pitfalls of reproduction and the impossibility of reproduction. And I would say that probably back then we should have also already seen the impossibility of reproduction, but now it's blatantly clear that this is one and the same thing. And the question is to Helmut, because I find like in your talk, what you still distinguished is like, in your talk, there is a choice. There's the choice to engage with the pitfalls of reproduction and be critical, or with the impossibility of reproduction. And I would say that choice has ceased to exist. There is a necessity to engage with the impossibility of reproduction and like understand everything we do from there.
Just a note to mental health. Thank you for bringing that up. Because it's relevant, but also because it kind of reminds us that there are institutions from different orders, and I would see mental health institutions as part of the disciplinary order, and maybe without, this is just kind of an instant thought that the liberal institutions of art being from a different order, and having to do much more with self-management. And the violence that comes with that, also the reproductive labor that comes with that. So I think it's important that to remind ourselves that the disciplinary institutions still do exist, and they still also shape the realities by force for many bodies that that we haven't talked about. But that reminds me also of, and this is again like maybe a response to Helmut, that violence mostly has an address. So you could be in the same space and it's addressed at one body and it's not addressed at the other. So you don't necessarily are exposed to the violence, even though the violence structurally is in the room. That's why I find it so important to think through things structurally. For example, racism, and that's why the liberal institution might feel like a better choice because some bodies are not addressed by the violence it produces. So just to say that just because the liberal institutions are not part of the disciplinary order, they still produce violence. Then to the question of how to operate within the order of the fetish of the sovereign individual. That's a very crucial question, and I can't just, if I'm honest, I can't say that it's easy to let go of the privilege it brings to say, oh, it's just art, and to kind of duck away when the shit hits the fan, because you still believe that some liberals will come to rescue you. But I did have to learn very early on that actually the only answer to this is self-organization, and that's something that I'm deeply invested in, and it brings all of the headache of collectivity, and the labor that collectivity means, but also a lot of the dissonance that it brings. But I think self-organization would be one of the ways in which to create a different idea of self-determination, let's say. I don't want to use the word freedom, but self-determination, that the artist has so long stood for as a model of self-determination. So these two.
Thank you also for the comment about institutionalization or incarceration. I mean, there are obviously many forms where it's not possible to leave the institution. So, but I would agree with Natascha that there's a different order. I think I would just agree with everything you said. No to that question, because obviously also liberal institutions, if we take Alberto Toscano seriously, don't treat everyone in the same way. So the underbelly of the liberal institution is for the people where the violence is directed, a form of fascism, I would imagine. I mean, I think this is what he's saying, right? So I think I agree with that. Also historically. And then in relation to the question of the Cameron Rowland, I think I was interested in this question of land art, and also in relation to how Marina was rethinking this, and Cameron Rowland's work Depreciation was very interesting in the sense in relation to how it's framing the question of value, rental contracts, or how they are also using the law, the liberal institution of the law as a kind of tool within this. But we could talk about that more later, because I think there's like more to say in a larger version of this. That I've got more to say about it. Okay. Maybe also just to cast in about the architecture or this memory. Yeah, I mean, I would just agree. But thanks for the comment.
Okay, yeah. Thank you for the questions. Yeah, I would like to try to combine, the question from Kerstin with that of Angela, but maybe it's a bit too difficult. But I think this kind of this experience that the spaces have become so tight in a certain way, and that the possibilities of using reproductive modes in a progressive way still are surely vanishing on many layers. And I think that is also, I would agree completely. But, and however, I remain, what is it, an optimist, so to say, in terms of, the possibilities of the gaps, of how to use the gaps. And there are still, because I can see there are, those are the forest totalizations, that there is no space left, but if we don't agree on that, then we have to say there is space left, in a certain way. It is institutionally shaped. It produces its own violences, for sure, exclusion, first of all, many others which registers of violence, but it's not, direct, it's mediated violence, not immediate violence, meaning fascist, direct, corporal violence in that sense. And I find it important to distinguish that. So that allows us, liberal institutions allow us to deal and to negotiate and to question this kind of violence, whereas fascist violence do not, simply. There is a slight difference, I would say. There is a gap, and a gap we have to use in one way or another. Conceptually, I think that is very important. But and in an analytic sense, how we understand that spaces, this in-between spaces of possibilities, even if the world seems to to become very tight in many respects. So, and this relates to the question of empirical and the transcendental in a certain way, because for me, this is the real reason why, I went into that out, a long time Deleuzian readings ago. But Deleuze himself had this, he tried to make empiricism transcendental. So, and it's very clear that this distinction, between what if we talk on a level of concepts, of ideas in a certain way, that there is a difference to, to the material or empirical struggles, and that concerns politics, in my understanding, in a very deep way. So there is no, like in the 1960s when they thought, can we realize, herrschaftsfreie Gesellschaft, society without any rule, in an empirical sense, I would, and that was the decisive question, are you left or right, But today I would say, of course not, because we are really only on an empirical level, and there's no evidence, that we could ever achieve that because of this social differences and of this, gaps we are constantly producing ourselves. But there is this transcendental level, there is this idea, the famous Badiouian, Žižekian idea of communism, which I think is important in a certain way. Nevertheless, there are many aspects to be criticized on that, but the idea itself is important in order to relate and to find a layer which goes beyond beyond the purely empirical, and that's why I became more and more skeptical about this kind of purely empiricist readings, and they imply also that we can distinguish, and I would also agree, between different levels of institutions, Obviously, mental health institutions, art institutions, educational institutions produce their own different kinds of violence. That was already Althusser's point in a certain way. But I don't see, and that is what is the vanishing point. Do we have a position where we can speak in the name of nonviolence completely? I cannot. I know that. I'm sitting here on the stage. I'm already executing violence, and probably you also, in one way or another. I have my, I lack vision in this respect. Yeah, I have no idea how this could work, in terms of, empirical politics. And that's why I would say, but we have to put it into question, as part of the political struggle in a way which contains a certain impossibility that we contribute ourselves in making this, spaces tight, and that is the struggle is about, keeping it open, even if it is probably very difficult to do under the given circumstances.
Thank you. I mean, I would have to comment a lot on that, but I would like to take the questions. But maybe if I may, a very short comment, because political theory can help us a lot to maybe use some tools how to do the connections, especially if we use all these big terms like liberalism, fascism, violence, and so on. And to me, we have to cut it down more specific, let's say, in this context, in this country, to situate ourselves to talk about, because otherwise it's very big. And I want to say that there is a connection, for example, historically, between liberalism and fascism. You also said that, like touching upon the white supremacy context and how we can see it there. And of course, there are crucial divisions between liberalism and fascism as antithetical poles, but there are also connections within that, because some people, identities, bodies, minds have been excluded there, and there are connections in the exclusions, and there are connections in the inclusions, of course. And nowadays, we are talking about authoritarian liberalism, which is a historical continuation in some terms, but also, let's say, an updated version of fascism. And then I'm not going to go into all these different political analysts that if it's very new or it's a continuation, but we have to do with something that is, we know from the past, but it has a different, let's say, attitude and a different performance today, and we're part of that and implicit in that. And also, we are here and we are in it, as also Danny said. So we have to take it from today, maybe, and draw the connections to the past and, of course, to the future we would like to make together, maybe. So I will open. Please.
Yeah, I mean, observing yesterday's Danny's part and today, it's like becoming very clear to me that to understand infrastructure critique, one has to be in constant movement. And it also relates to what you said about it being multifaceted, but it's not a multifaceted that one can see in a still position, but you have to be in a movement. And maybe that's why being a migrant actually kind of brings a totally different perspective into this, because you embody movement as a migrant, because it's not just that you migrated, you're constantly in this movement between these two places. And as to say about the gap, I would not count so much on the gap, because this whole thing with liberal and fascism, they are sticky. And as you said, when the dust settles of the rubbles that are in all these genocides, the gap would be filled with the dust and all would be the same. And then, another thing I want to say as a personal thing, that I came to Austria because I didn't want to be an artist under authoritarianism, but the past 2 years has been really, really, really scary here. And I would not call this being an artist as part of liberal institutions anymore, because if you can get fired for voicing out your opinion, or if your workshop get canceled because you want to mention the word genocide, this doesn't come for me under the term like a liberal, that the violence of it is not direct anymore. So I would not even call that this is a mediated violence. It's like actually a very direct type of violence. So in that sense, I think I would invite just more of a movement into understanding and looking at what infrastructural critique is.
Thank you. We'll take another one.
I'm gonna stand up because you asked this too. I would like to call into attention that we had 2 proposals for visualizations of infrastructural critique. which one was, thank you very much for sharing that sketch of the map of Marina Vishmidt. And then there was a diagram which I only sketched in my head, which came from Helmut Draxler. And I think I would like to, it's a call from last night to think through these, what it could be. And I'm sure we have more time tomorrow night because this might get too long otherwise. But just to draw attention to these two maps, and impromptu, these three planes are separate. I remember there was the mental, the social, and the material. And the material technological would be the infrastructure. And I think if infrastructural critique is somewhat also a categorical notion, a tactical, or one that puts a category, then maybe these three planes, if it was not just the critique of infrastructures, but also a critique done in an infrastructural way, these three planes couldn't be separated. I wonder about that. And in this other map, this sketch, there's the fires and the waters, and I thought of Denise Ferreira da Silva's notion of difference without separability, where she also talks about onto-epistemological notions of entanglements of worlds, and that of course undoes any kind of premise of thought I've been socialized or educated with, so it's a tricky one. But this map, I think, this really called upon that. And if these two are maybe also two sides of the coin, like how to do infrastructural critique in an infrastructural way, and I mean, that's also great to critique infrastructures. Yeah, and then we had two proposals of visualizations. So to take those along, I would propose. And what do you have to say to that?
And was the last person over there? Yeah. And then we have 5 minutes to wrap it up.
I just wanted to thank the chair for introducing a little bit more complexity into the argument, because from political theory, because I think it's very important in polarizing times that we live in and polarized institutional analysis that we remember the complexity of these situations, and that there are still people who would like to see democratic institutions, even social democratic institutions, which where it isn't just a case of reinforcing old-fashioned liberalism or new-fashioned MAGA politics, that there are more diversities that can be put into play. And it seems to me that we fall into the polarizing binary oppositions too easily in how we structure thought. And we have to keep remembering, which I think is a lesson from Marina, there's always third or fourth or even fifth positions that we could adopt and that we should think about.
Thank you. Yeah, okay, let's have a last comment, because it was 4 people at the same time and I don't want to do so much injustice. Yeah.
So,
yeah, good.
Yeah, I was a bit like also trying to connecting it's more like a comment, sorry. It's connecting the last talk last night and what's happening today, and there was I was kind of like aware of this, the gap was kind of like quite prominent today, and then also this of, I think it was this unworking and unfunctioning stuff. And so, and it just, I maybe met Marina first with the unemployed cinema, which was also kind of like this situation. And here we see in the visualization that also in a conference and celebration, and there's also this gap in life, and then work of Marina Vishmidt is kind of like maybe also another visualization of the situation. And I came up with the idea that maybe also that I experienced her work and life always also about these gaps, but the gap not at something which is the place or another position where you want to be, but something you want to kind of like pass through and kind of like relating to this. And I think there was also the term of the interface, and maybe that's maybe something which should be brought up also, because I once discussed it with this Galloway book with this, the unworking interface, where this comes all together. And I was also thinking about this, that maybe when you see this kind of like trespassings or interfaces, I think there are kind of like interfaces who work in kind of like both directions. And then there are, of course, like interfaces who maybe not work in both directions. So, and that's somehow I always experienced that Marina was a bit up for the second ones, of course, and trying really like to mediate between this kind of like ideas of what are the situations, and then it's more like a passing through gaps and not falling into a hole as a gap. So